Okay, Bruchim Haba, and welcome everyone to the beginning of our new cycle of shiurim on Sefer Bereishis, which are dedicated by Dr. Zaki B'Mishpachtai. And it's a great zchus to be beginning again Sefer Bereishis. And today we're going to focus on the very first Rashi in Chumash and the Ramban's interpretation of this Rashi and the historic impact of the comments of Rashi. Rashi famously begins, Amar Rabbi Yitzchak. And it's certainly worthy of our attention. Why does Rashi begin his commentary, Amar Rabbi Yitzchak? What is the hashkacha that the perush of Rashi begins, Amar Rabbi Yitzchak? The Torah really should have began with HaChodesh Hazeh Lachem, she mitzvah rishona shenistava by Yisroel. It's the very first mitzvah that Klal Yisrael were commanded. After all, the Torah is not a history book. The Torah is a book of law. The Torah is a book of halacha. Torah is milashon moira, teaching. So the Torah should begin with the very first mitzvah that Klal Yisrael were commanded, namely HaChodesh Hazeh Lachem. Umatam pasach bebereishis. Why does the Torah begin with Bereishis, with the creation of the world? It's not a history book. It says Rashi, Mishum Kayach Ma'asav Higid La'amoy Laseis Lahem Nachlas Goyim. The pasuk says in Tehillim, the strength of his deeds. He tells his people to give them the inheritance of the nations of the world. This is a very great principle. Kayach Ma'asav Higid La'amoy Laseis Lahem Nachlas Goyim. Hashem showed the strength of his deeds of Bria Shamayim Va'aretz in order to give us Eretz Yisroel. Shem Yoimru Umay Sa'olam, because theoretically, if the nations of the world were to say that we're colonizers, we're occupiers, Li Yisrael listim atem, you're robbers, you're stealing. Shekavashtem Artzei Shiva Goyim, you conquered the lands of the seven nations. Hey Moimrim Lahem, we would say back, no. Kal Haaretz Shel HaKadosh Baruch Hu Hi. The whole world belongs to God. Hu Bara, God created it, Unesana, and He gave it LaAsher Yashar Be'enav, to He who is just in His eyes. Bertsoinoi Nesano Lahem, with His will He gave it to them. Uvertsoinoi, with His will Netala Mehem, He took it from them. Unesano Lano, and He gave it to us. Says Rashi, the reason why the Torah begins with Bereishis, with the creation of heaven and earth, is if theoretically, if the nations were to claim that Eretz Yisrael belongs to them, we would respond, no, God created the world and He gives it to who He wants. Now, if you want to know why throughout history have the nations of the world claimed that Eretz Yisrael was theirs, most notably Yishmael, the answer is it's part of the very fabric of creation. The foundation of all creation is the challenge to our ownership of Eretz Yisrael and our eternal response of the creation of the world. So when we see that throughout history, there are always challengers to the ownership of Eretz Yisrael, that authenticates the Torah, because the foundational principle of the Torah is predicated on the idea that there will always be challengers to our ownership of Eretz Yisrael, and we will always respond, no, God created the world, and He gives it to whoever He wants. Kayach Ma'asav Higid La'amoy Laseis Lahem Nachlas Goyim. Reb Chaim Falaji wrote a sefer called Chaim Techila. Actually, most of Reb Chaim Falaji's svarim have the word Chaim in it, where he connects the end of V'zois HaBracha to the beginning of Bereishis in 101 ways. In his fifth way, he happens to bring that since the reason the Torah begins with Bereishis is because of Kayach Ma'asav Higid La'amoy, that God wanted to show His people, Klal Yisrael, the strength of His deeds. So the Torah ends Li Yisrael, that you know what's for Yisrael? Bereishis. The fact that it begins with Bereishis is for Yisrael, Kayach Ma'asav Higid La'amoy. But he says something amazing. Since the purpose of Bereishis is Kayach Ma'asav Higid La'amoy, therefore the first pasuk in Bereishis has Kayach letters, 28 letters, because its purpose is Kayach Ma'asav. Therefore, they're Kayach letters in the first pasuk of Bereishis. But let's analyze this Rashi. I want to share with you the way the Vilna Gaon understands Rashi, the way the Chafetz Chaim understands it, and we're going to focus on the Ramban. The Vilna Gaon understands Rashi, that certainly the Torah needed to begin with the creation of the world. That's the foundational principle of the Torah. What Rashi is really bothered by, what Chazal really bothered by, is why does the Torah include the embarrassing story of Cham castrating his father Noach? That's what Rashi is bothered by. Why do we need that story? The story of Cham and Noach. And the answer to that is to understand why Hashem rejected them from the land of Canaan. Because of the despicable act of Cham and Canaan, they were banished from Eretz Yisroel, and it now belongs to us. That's how the Vilna Gaon in Hadaras Eliyahu understands these words of Chazal. This morning, in our shir on from the Chafetz Chaim, we pointed out that the Chafetz Chaim understands, based on the pasuk, Ma godlu ma'asecha Hashem, ma'od amku machshavaisecha. As deep as the Torah is, and as deep as mitzvahs are, even deeper than that is Hashem's running of the universe. So it's important to read all of these stories of creation and Masa Bereishis and Hashem's running of the world in order for us to study something even deeper than the Torah itself, namely the way Hashem interacts with the world. But let's come back for a moment to the words of Rashi. Rashi is telling us throughout history, if the nations of the world ever challenge our ownership of Eretz Yisrael, we will respond to them, no, God created the world and He gives it to whoever He pleases. Let me ask you a question. Who throughout history has challenged our ownership to Eretz Yisrael? Yishmael. Yishmael is always challenging our ownership of Eretz Yisrael. And, so to speak, who is the antithesis of Yishmael? Whose koyach counteracts the koyach of Yishmael? It's Yitzchak. It's Yitzchak. In other words, the opening Rashi in Chumash is trying to explain how Yitzchak triumphs over Yishmael. Yishmael is going to say, Listim atem, you're robbers. And we need to respond with the koyach of Yitzchak over Yishmael. Perhaps that's part of the hashkacha, that the opening words of Rashi, ala Torah, are Amar Rabbi Yitzchak. It's the koyach of Yitzchak that we have to overcome the taina of Yishmael of Listim atem. But I want to share with you the Ramban's approach to these words of Chazal. Because the Ramban is also troubled. Really? The Torah should not begin with the creation of the world? Isn't the creation of the world the very foundation of all of Judaism, of Yahadus, that Hashem created the world? Yesh me'ayin. So of course we need to begin Bereishis bara Elokim es hashamayim es haaretz. So the Ramban explains as follows. The Ramban says, yeah, we need to begin with the creation of the world, but does anybody actually understand the psukim about the creation of the world? Nobody actually understands them. Nobody knows what it means that in the beginning it was tohu vavoyu. It was astonishingly empty. Nobody knows what it means to be astonishingly empty. I remember when I was in yeshiva, so they would teach the pasuk, Veha Eretz, undi erd, haisa soyu vavoyu. Soyu vavoyu, they teached pustin leidik. Nobody knew what pustin means, nobody knew what leidik means, and nobody knows what tohu vavoyu means. What's the difference between empty and astonishingly empty? So we don't know what this means. Do we know what it means? There's a rakia between the mayim alyon and mayim tachtoinim. All of these things are great mysteries. Says Ramban, the question is not why does it begin with Masa Bereishis. The question is why does it describe Masa Bereishis in such great detail, where anyway we don't have an understanding of what Masa Bereishis is all about. So if we don't understand it, why describe it in detail? Furthermore, why do we need the stories of Adam Arishon in Gan Eden? Do we know what it means that there was an Eitz Hadas? Do we know what it means that there was a Nachash who tried to persuade and seduce Adam to eat from the Eitz Hadas? We don't understand what these narratives mean anyway. Therefore, says the Ramban, Of course, we need to mention that Hashem created the world in 6 days and He rested on the seventh day. But just say very briefly, Ki sheishes yamim asa Hashem es hashamayim v'es haaretz. Just say Hashem created the world in 6 days. Why this detailed account of creation on each day when we don't know what it means anyway? Why all of these narratives? We understand the kinds of sins they were involved in the Dar HaMabul and the Dar HaFlaga. These episodes are above and beyond our understanding. So then why describe them? Why go into detail when we don't understand the detail? That's the kasha, Amar Rabbi Yitzchak. Basically, don't start the detail until we get up to Torah mitzvahs. We need to know the generalities, but why the detail? That's the kasha that Rabbi Yitzchak is bringing. And the answer is as follows. The answer is, the central principle of world history is that this world belongs to Hashem. Specifically, Eretz Yisroel. Specifically, the Machon Maggid Harakiah. That is the central principle of hashgacha in world history. That we need to know that God created the world, it belongs to Him, and only those who do the will of God, especially in the land of Israel, will merit to remain in this world and will merit to remain in the land of Israel. But those who violate the will of God will not be able to stay in the land, especially won't be able to stay in the land of Israel, especially in the holy places in this world. Therefore, the Torah begins with a detailed description of the creation of the world to focus and highlight the central idea of world history, that Hashem created the world. He created with a detailed plan, and therefore, only if you follow His guidelines can you stay in this world. In the world in general, especially in the holy places. So for example, Adam and Chava are in the Garden of Eden. They're in Gan Eden. And in Gan Eden is like Makom HaMuvchar Hashem. It's the choicest place of God. And therefore in Gan Eden, if you're in Gan Eden and you take one wrong step, you make one left turn, you're going to be chased out. And that's what happened to Adam and Chava. Hashem didn't give them a 30-day, Hashem didn't give them a warning in the mail that they have to respond to in 30 days. Immediately, within the hour, they were chased out of Gan Eden. And there was a angel with a flashing sword, waving the sword to make sure they would never come back. This highlights the great principle that since Hashem created the world, if you're not going to follow His rules in His holy places, you're out of there. You have no right to the land. The story of the creation of the world, the story of Adam and Chava in Gan Eden, is to highlight the central principle that in this world, especially in holy places, especially in Eretz Yisroel, if you don't do the will of God, you're out of there immediately. By the way, this is a phenomenon we saw with our own eyes 2 years ago. Of course, it was a terrible disaster. And of course, our enemies deserve retribution. But it also highlights the idea that in the land of Israel, the Jewish people, even in the end of days, have to be so careful that they follow the will of Hashem. Otherwise, the land does not tolerate them, and the land will expectorate them. That is the lesson of the story of Adam, Arishan, and Chava and Gan Eden. That's why it's included. That's why the narrative of creation is included. That's why the story of Adam and Chava and Gan Eden are included. That's why the story of the Dar HaMabul is included. Because if you're not going to follow God's laws in this world, then you can't be in this world. That's why the story of the Dar HaFlaga is included. The Ramban understands that Rashi's comments of Koyach Masav Higid La'amay Laseis Lohem Nachlas Goyim, and that's the reason why the opening pasuk in Bereishis has 28 letters. Koyach Masav Koyach. It's to indicate this central lesson. God created the world. There's no such thing as occupiers or colonizers. God gives it to the most deserving at that time. And therefore, whenever the nations of the world challenge our rights to Eretz Yisrael, we say Hashem created it and He gives it to who He chooses. And that's another aspect of the principle that we saw. Because even though we saw what happened on Simchas Torah 2 years ago, but in the aftermath of that, this principle was applied to our enemies 1,000 times over. That once they did what they did, they certainly abandoned their right to the land. And that's why the retribution for them was swift in coming. This is the central principle of Torah and world history. God created the world, and He gives the world, and specifically Eretz Yisrael, and most specifically His Mekayimos HaKadoshim, to those who are most fitting. So according to the Ramban, Koyach Masav Higid La'amoy Laseis Lahem Nachlas Goyim is not only a principle that is limited, it's not only a principle that's limited to Masa Bereishis, it includes the episode of the Dar HaMabel, where because Hashem created the world, the people in those times, in that time, also had to be removed from the world. And Adam, Arisha, and Chava, they were in the choicest spot in the world. They were chased out of that spot. This all highlights and reflects the principle of Kayach Ma'asav Higid La'amoy Laseis Lahem Nachlas Goyim. The Gur Aryeh adds one more idea. The Gur Aryeh says, aside from the fact of the inherent importance of recognizing the rightful owners of Eretz Yisrael and the world at large, this, working with the original premise of Rashi, that the Torah is a book of law and halacha, so really it should begin with HaChodesh Hazeh Lachem. The Gur Aryeh enunciates a great principle of the Ramban himself, and that is, since the purpose of the Torah is to teach Klal Yisrael how to observe the Torah, and a very large section of the Torah can only be fulfilled in Eretz Yisrael, all the mitzvahs tluyos ba'aretz, trumos, masros, shvius, and all the mitzvahs tied to the Beis HaMikdash and bringing karbanos. And since Eretz Yisrael is the land of Hashem and is greater in Maila than anywhere else in the world, and therefore the performance of all the mitzvahs is enhanced in Eretz Yisrael. Therefore, it's important to know what our claim to Eretz Yisrael is, not just so that it's clear that we're the rightful owners of the land, but we need to know that we're the rightful owners of the land, which is the place where the observance of the Torah was meant to be fulfilled. So it's not just informational in terms of our ownership of the land, but the ownership of the land is the prerequisite to fulfillment of the Torah itself. So working with Rashi's initial premise, that the Torah is not a book of history but a book of law, the answer is that even though it's a book of law, we still need to have clear our rightful ownership of Eretz Yisrael, because Eretz Yisrael is the designated location and venue to be able to mekayim the Torah. So this is all part of the way the Ramban understands the holy words of Chazal and Rashi. Kayach ma'asav higid la'amoy laseis lahem nachlas goyim. I'm going to tell you one more idea.